Okay, our next speaker is Dr. David Hayes, and David is well known to many within the school for his research and teaching and support, but David is an assistant professor here in the school with us. His primary research interests are at that intersection between psychology and video games, and include topics like player motivation, player engagement, and video game effects. David is himself an avid gamer, and I think it's fantastic that he combines his passion for gaming and interest in the gaming industry with this broad knowledge of psychology and high levels of research expertise. Outside of video games, David's research looks at individuals' engagement with media and technology very more broadly, and he has recently been conducting research that's funded by Enterprise Ireland to look at the factors that make smartphone apps more engaging. So David, I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation. So thank you.
Thanks a million, Susie. So as Susie mentioned, I'm David Hayes. My area of research is all on gaming and the applications of gaming, and I suppose what I would like to try and do with this talk today is speak a little bit to my work and how I understand the experience, but also I suppose I'm trying to convince you all of two things as people working in psychology or as people who are interested in psychology. The first is I would like to try and convince you that video games are not only an important aspect of psychological study, but that it's highly likely that they are applicable or could be applicable to your own work. And then secondly, I kind of want to convince you that my way of thinking about them is right, but that we need this kind of broader perspective, this more holistic understanding to be able to achieve that aim. So, first of all, in terms of, I suppose, trying to convince you why video games are important to study, the easy one is to look at the figures and to bombard you with how important these are in society. First of all, there's an estimated 3.2 billion players worldwide, and far from this idea that was held for a long time that video games were the domain of kind of adolescent, isolated males, huge portions of society and very different groups within society play video games. This is just within Europe, so a little more than half of the European population aged 5 to 64 plays games. The average player is actually 32 years old, but most players in Europe fall within that 45 to 64 age group category, which might be surprising to some of you. And then most players spend a huge amount of time actually playing video games. So in Europe, the average player spends about 8.8 hours, but that can be a lot higher with kind of these heavier users. Similar results are seen in the United States as well. Beyond this, people spend huge sums of money on video games and highly invested in this hobby. So last year, players in the States alone spent 56.6 billion. And the video game industry is now one of the most successful entertainment industries in the world. And then beyond the actual playing of video games, players spend a lot of time, I suppose, reading about, watching videos, kind of engaging in gaming material outside of just playing video games. So we think about streaming sites like YouTube and Twitch. Channels with gaming related content tend to attract millions of subscribers and generate billions of video views. And so it's maybe alarmingly, a lot of the very, very influential people now who are kind of shaping young minds tend to be these YouTube streamers. So it's also worth bearing that in mind. With all of these figures, it tends to prompt these two kinds of research questions. So one is, how can we explain the appeal of video games? What makes 3.2 billion people want to play video games? And then the second, which psychologists have tended to focus on for a long time, is what are the effects? And with that latter point in mind, a lot of the time we tend to focus on the negative effects of video games. So the big topic, the big question that I am always asked is, do video games cause violence? Are they murder simulators? And I mean, I kind of put that up facetiously, but modern video games are much more graphically realistic, and now we have situations where we can play a first-person shooter game like Grand Theft Auto in VR on a trackpad and walk around with a gun. So it's getting closer and closer to that idea, but the question remains, does it? And I think that the research out there has a long way to go in relation to that. Next, we have the idea of the links between video games and poor mental health, and in particular with the decision around, or the inclusion of gaming disorder within the ICD-11, which wasn't without controversy. There's a lot of focus on the amount of time, particularly that young people are spending playing video games, and what are the implications of that. And then finally, there's some focus on this link between video game play or engaging with video games and its links with gambling, particularly in terms of some of the monetization strategies that gaming companies use, such as things like loot boxes, which are very similar to kind of those slot machines. Beyond the negative effects, and I thought it was appropriate to consider some of Aidan's work in this area. So Aidan, as I'm sure as many of you know, was very much focused on expertise in different contexts, particularly sports. But one of the areas that he and his colleagues were starting to look at was this idea of esports, so professional video game competitions as a means to look at the development of neurocognitive expertise. And in this chapter, they point to this idea that in order to be successful in terms of playing a game, it involves an intricate mix of bimanual motor movements, involves processing complex visual stimuli, allocating attentional resources to multiple different items, making decisions. So it requires a huge amount of effort and cognitive demand on part of the players. This is one of the most popular games in the world. This is a League of Legends, and this is one of the esports that professional players compete for prizes of up to $1 million. And you can see here, I am an avid gamer, and I don't know what's going on here. So hopefully you're the same. But you can see the level of intensity. You can see the amount of information that needs to be kind of retained and processed in terms of this. And I suppose, unsurprisingly, given that there does appear to be these positive kind of cognitive effects of playing video games in terms of things like attentional control, speed of processing, and working memory, which certainly might be important for those of you focused on studying those kind of cognitive aspects in terms of the samples that you were including. I could have also included here the social benefits, but I kind of wanted to treat that as a separate point. So I think the third reason why video games are important to study from a psychological perspective is that video games and the culture surrounding them are both social spaces and socially relevant or socially important spaces. So most games these days, most popular games these days, have a social component. Most video game players are playing with other people, be it friends or strangers online. And research suggests that, certainly for this group of American players, that most are talking about games as a way of feeling kind of this sense of community, of expanding their social circle, of helping them to stay connected. And what's interesting there is I think that half of American players are talking about how they have either met a good friend or their spouse or significant other through the playing of video games. But beyond this idea of video games being social and socially important spaces, they can be an avenue for people to kind of feel included and to explore their identity. So there's some research to suggest, and some charities that have sprung up around this idea of using video games as a means of including people with disability, and where players with disabilities can use video games as a way of kind of shaping an identity that they may be limited from doing in the real world. We also have evidence to suggest that gamers, particularly those who are experimenting with genders or thinking about genders or who might be transgender, are using video games and using these kind of different avatars as a means of exploring that and perhaps in some ways as an avenue of transitioning. And then we have these huge communities of minority groups that use video games as a way to feel connected with others. Now, that's not to say that it's all positive. I mean, we're all familiar with this idea of toxic gamers and toxic communities. And indeed, in addition to being spaces for inclusion, for exploration of identity, they can also be hostile, unwelcoming, and discriminatory. So, for example, research consistently indicates that female players particularly have to change the way they play to avoid being harassed. So it affects what games they play, it affects whether they engage in conversation, etc. And then players who are not straight white males are still underrepresented in games, and where that representation has started to improve, a lot of the time it's quite shallow, it's tokenistic, or it is problematic where you've people from minority groups being represented in a very kind of stereotypical, offensive way, or as the antagonist of the game. And this is just from a bit of work that I did. We asked players what were the important things that shaped their experiences, and one of the players mentioned this idea of avoiding certain games for fear of being harassed or judged, and then that idea of how her gender was represented in games was really, really offensive and frustrating, because it was suggesting that these are the qualities that you need to be in order to be female. The fourth, I think, area to consider is this idea of serious games and gamification, or the use of games for addressing societal issues. So increasingly, video games and principles from gaming are being used for improving learning, for bringing about behavioural change, for improving health outcomes, and also in terms of improving psychological well-being. Now, there's two different approaches here. One is serious games, where a fully fledged game is developed, where the idea is that the learning or the behavioural change is embedded within the context of the gameplay. The other then, which tends to be more popular or more common, is gamification, where you use things like leaderboards or points or badges to promote engagement in a behaviour that's outside the game. So let's say, for example, you wanted to improve someone's exercise patterns, you might get them to enter in what exercise they're doing, and the more exercise they do, the more points they get, the more badges they get, and that's meant to be motivating. There is some evidence to suggest that serious games are effective. So, for example, this was a serious game around a kind of refugee crisis in Darfur, and some research around it found that it elicited greater role-taking and a willingness to help the people involved than just reading a text.
2 minutes left.
Okay, perfect. But the quality of the research in the area can be quite poor, and serious games need to be really carefully designed. There's this idea that if you just use a video game, that will make it all better, and that will make your intervention more effective. And I think that could be really inappropriate, as I have demonstrated in some of my work. The last area that I wanted to talk about is video game entertainment itself. I think sometimes when you say that you're a video game researcher, people prompt you with those other three areas: video game effects in terms of positive and negative, the use of games, and things like addiction. And I think we overlook the fact that video game entertainment is fundamentally a psychological experience that's best understood through this perspective. And then beyond that, as I'm sure Bren mentioned earlier in his talk, video games can offer these rich, dynamic contexts in which to study all manner of psychological phenomena. So just in terms of why study video games, we have these reasons, and I argue that by understanding video game entertainment improves our understanding of the other avenues and allows us to be more effective in that way. Just to say that current understanding of game entertainment comes from a very diverse, multidisciplinary field. There's this general agreement that entertainment can be conceptualized in terms of enjoyment and appreciation. But beyond that, there's huge disagreement within the field. There's a large number of constructs being proposed with little agreement as to which should be included in conceptualizations. And then particularly in terms of the multidisciplinary field, there's ongoing definitional issues whereby a lot of the time researchers are kind of talking past each other. And cementing these issues is the lack of a clear and comprehensive theory to guide and unify research efforts. Just going to skip that. With this in mind, we recognize this need for kind of a broader conceptualization of the experience that could account for the wide variety of different factors that might be involved in terms of things like who the player is, what they do in the game, what's the context within which they are, what's the design of the games. There's lots of different aspects that existing theories aren't really thinking about. And so we focused on mapping out these components through a systematic scoping review of 20 gaming-specific theories and then an online survey of 400 video game players. And the result was this, and I'll finish up now, sorry Lizzie. So we have conceptualized video game entertainment in terms of a person's cognitions, emotion and behaviors before, during and after play, and then looked at the factors that influence that, both in terms of the context within which the gameplay experience is happening, the design of the game and the design of the technology, and then also some player factors in terms of who the player is as a player and who the player is as an individual person. Happy to chat about this on the break, and I'm sorry that I was a little bit over time, but thank you very much.